or good morning. We have an international audience, as I mentioned, so I'm hoping that multiple time zones are represented in our engaged audience. I'm so delighted to welcome everyone back to our second panel at the Psychedelics Go webinar. This one's going to be equally inspiring and exciting as our quagmire. In case you didn't know, there is actually an insurance quagmire around ketamine. I'll date myself a little bit. I'm in my late 50s and I came of age in the late 70s. And back then, the first time I ever had any exposure to ketamine was a street drug that made its way through our high school quickly under the unfortunate moniker of horse tranquilizer, which it actually is partly a horse tranquilizer. I remember the first time someone offered me, they said, "Do you want horse tranquilizer?" And I said, "Do I look like a horse? No, I do not want horse tranquilizer." But of course, we've discovered that there's a reason why humans were seeking this out, and now it's approved off-label FDA medication and Health Canada medication. And there's a lot of promise and already efficacy and methodology showing just how transformative ketamine can be in several instances of intractable mental health. I do believe it's the go-to quick remedy for persistent suicide ideation, and it really is a product unlike anything ever, or a molecule that has really allowed practitioners and doctors, psychiatrists in the most serious of settings to really solve a previously unsolved problem, or at least ameliorate a previous unsolved problem. So with that being said, we again are grateful to have some of the real thought leaders in our industry that are going to help fill in some of the blanks around the insurance issue, as well as probably just some general comments about the development of the ketamine industry, which those of us that pay attention to the industry see it's developing fast. There are mondo amount of clinics already existing and being added to. But we're going to have to throw it to our fearless leader today. The moderator of today's panelists is my friend and my co-principal at Psychedelics Go, Los Arias. He goes by Carlos, but everyone knows him as Los. Los is a co-founder and co-CEO of Green Horizons, which is a cannabis business based in Coachella Valley, I believe, and building a massive scale production facility and manufacturing facility. And previous to that, he was a principal at both Desert Horizon and River Rock in Colorado, Desert Horizon in California, both also licensed cannabis entities. But I know Los, first of all, as a shaman. Truthfully, for a long time, and I think it's fair to say that he is a shaman. He is probably he certainly received more, gone through more ceremony than anyone I ever met in my life, across a wide variety of jurisdictions and substances and locations. And in fact, Los was my spirit guide into the world of 5-MeO-DMT when he, after years of persistent lobbying, convinced me to make the trek to Topanga, California, lie in a hut on a mat, and have a transportive experience in less than 45 minutes. I'm still dealing with that years later.
This is becoming a different kind of panel, but okay, let's keep going.
Just describing, so Los is really, as I'm going to throw it to him right now, but I mentioned that because he's not your typical moderator from the corporate world, although he's an attorney by training and is a CEO of a large company. He really, more than anyone I've met, has embraced and made his life's mission the medicine from A to Z in a way that I've never seen really anyone in my life. So we're honored and delighted to have him. I'll throw it to Los, and I'm so excited to hear the content that's about to follow.
Oh, goodness, brother. Well, thank you so much, Paul. And how could I possibly follow that up or live up to it? But I'll try my best. And, you know, psychedelics is definitely near and dear to my heart. I've worked with a lot of medicines over the years. I'm Brazilian. It's sort of in the blood. But the focus today is ketamine and the insurance quagmire that Paul referenced. And I'm honored to be here with the real rock stars, who I'd love to, you know, have an opportunity for them to introduce themselves. And then we'll get into some, you know, conversations about where we're at with ketamine and insurance. So maybe, Jack, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, brother? We'll start with you, and everybody can just go around and tell the audience a little bit about yourself, you know, what you're doing, and then we'll dive into to some questions.
Yeah, perfect. I'm Jack Swain. I'm the head of clinical operations at MindBloom, which is a mental health and well-being platform that provides clinician-prescribed at-home guided ketamine treatments for anxiety and depression. Prior to MindBloom, I worked in healthcare consulting for a company called the Chartist Group, where I led strategy and operations projects at health systems like Cleveland Clinic and Michigan Medicine.
Thank you. Carlene, speak to us, my friend.
All right. So my name is Carlene MacMillan. I'm an adult and child psychiatrist and the founder of Brooklyn Minds, which is a large mental health practice in New York City. And we were one of the first, if not the first, to implement S-Ketamine in New York. I'm also on the ketamine task force for insurance coverage with Lucia, and I see Kimberly in the audience today. And then finally, most recently, joined Osmind as their medical director of growth and product. So wearing multiple hats today and very excited to talk about insurance.
Great. Lucia, you're up. Let's do it.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm Lucia. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Osmind. I'm very lucky to be working with Carlene and familiar with a lot of folks on this panel and in the audience today. So thanks for taking the time. I come from a healthcare background through and through. I spent my first few years in finance, focusing on investing in healthcare, IT, and life sciences companies. And then spent time running business and operations at a neuroscience biotech startup. And really fell in love with where the whole field of neuroscience and neuropsychiatry are going, and recognized the immense role that psychedelic medicine has to play in all of that. So we co-founded Osmind a couple of years ago with the goal of building the infrastructure for the future of mental health and neuropsychiatry. And we're doing that through software that we've built for providers such as Carlene and many folks in the audience who are administering innovative mental health treatments, while at the same time aggregating information that we can then funnel back for research purposes and for ambitions such as petitioning for insurance coverage. So very excited to be here today.
Wow, thank you for that. Awesome. Carl, you're up, my friend. Let's do this.
Thanks, Louis. Hi, everybody. My name is Carl Bonnett. I am the founder and chief medical officer for Klarisana. So we're started in San Antonio. We now have 7 locations across Texas, Colorado, and New Mexico. And I'm an emergency physician by training. Did 20 years of that. Now doing full-time ketamine / psychedelic stuff. And a big part of my company came out of my upbringing, I guess, in emergency medicine, the idea of access and serving as a safety net for folks. So one of our founding principles is the idea that I don't want to hear that anybody ever takes their life because they can't afford to get psychedelic therapy. And that's been a big part of what we're trying to do and what we'll talk about today, I guess. So.
Wow, thank you. Receive, Carl, and thank you, esteemed panelists, for those great intros. And I feel like maybe a good place to start, and we'll open it up to the panel and we can just, free flow here with the audience. What options do patients have today? Would somebody care to sort of speak to that and sort of paint the landscape? If I'm a patient looking for this work, what are my options given the status of the insurance situation?
I guess I can start with that. So I think, one of the reasons why we introduced S-Ketamine into our practice was because the challenge in terms of options. So some patients who are well resourced or may have kind of donation money or something like that would be able to pay for ketamine treatments. So ketamine is off-label for psychiatric reasons and for chronic pain. So individuals seeking that out typically are having to pay out of pocket for that, which can be cost prohibitive for a number of them. And so another option that came on the scene in 2019 was S-Ketamine. So that was a new drug that has an FDA indication for depression and severe suicidal thinking. And so through that pathway, patients are able to use their insurance if they qualify. Usually that involves a number of different medication trials, different criteria, but then that presents a huge kind of branch point into what people are able to access as far as ketamine. Now, there are some newer developments. So there are pockets here and there, like in Massachusetts, where there is one payer that's now paying for IV ketamine similarly to how they're paying for S-Ketamine. And then there's some clinics, I think most recently Novamind announced that they were able to secure some coverage with certain payers. But that's really on a case-by-case basis. And so it's kind of an uphill battle to get insurance coverage for the IV formulation.
Okay, wow. Thank you for that.
To add another option, so depending on the way that you're getting your ketamine treatment, like, if it's IV in a clinic that has more of the medical infrastructure, that may be different from someone who's doing a ketamine-assisted psychotherapy session like at a psychiatrist's office or through MindBloom. There's a combination of psychiatric clinician services and coaching. And so some of these more standard clinician services, like a psychiatric evaluation, follow-up med management consult, those can be covered through out-of-network reimbursement by insurers, or in-network reimbursement if your psychiatry provider is in network for an insurance plan. So that's another way to get at least a component of, often a large component of the total treatment cost covered.
Well, thank you for that, Jack.
Yeah, just wanted to follow up on that point. That's something that we've seen in the clinics we work with. So just a bit of context, we work with close to 300 clinics around the US that are administering ketamine in all different routes of administration, S-Ketamine, TMS, and a lot of these other innovative mental health treatments. And that's exactly what we've seen as well, Jack, that a lot of providers and patients are going to submit out-of-network claims to activate those benefits. And it really depends on the insurance plan. But we've seen some patients get close to 100% back of their costs. We've seen some patients get $0 back. So it's definitely not guaranteed by any means, but we always tell our providers to communicate to patients it's worth trying because the ketamine, the cost of the ketamine itself is actually a small part of the overall treatment. And if you can sort of look at the other codes that are in use, you may be able to garner some level of out-of-network reimbursement based off that.
Yeah, Lucia, do you have a sense of what percentage of your clients are able to get, or of your clients' patients are able to get reimbursement in some or, go ahead.
Yeah, it's really all over the place, and it's hard to draw any sort of meaningful insights just because it depends so much on the plan, and even the person who picks up the phone at the insurance company, it's that finicky. But I'd say a third of patients are getting some level back, and within that, it's a pretty wide range.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would just add that, plans that are more likely to do that are going to be the self-funded plans that an employer has selected, because then the employer is going to have a little bit more flexibility and leeway in terms of determining what they want to reimburse compared to just the widespread insurance plans or plans people might purchase on a health exchange.
Got it. And on a cash basis, if someone was going to get no coverage, they wanted the treatment and they were paying cash, what are we looking at in terms of a dollar amount generally? Does anyone have a sense of what they cost?
Yeah, I can just give you some data just with, again, the clinics we work with around the country. So not speaking to any specific ones, but the range we've seen really depends on the geographic area and the route of administration. So for example, a pain infusion that's multiple hours is going to be quite a bit costlier than a 40-minute mental health infusion. Similarly, a CAP session that's oral and is multiple hours may be more expensive than a 40-minute infusion as well. So lots of different variables, but to just hone in on, let's say, a standard 40-minute ketamine infusion, we've seen anywhere from $300 to $800 all around the country, and that's largely dependent on the cost of living and the geographic area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so in New York, for example, I've had family members get courses of IV ketamine. It's roughly kind of $3,000 when all is said and done, not including kind of ongoing maintenance. So there can be payment plans, there can be financial hardship, sliding scales. Different clinics can figure out how they're wanting to address that.
Wow, thank you for that, Carlene. And sounds like this is the road for the patients. How about the point of view of the insurers? Do we have a sense of what kind of evidence they're looking for, what kind of protocol? What's the path forward there and sort of embracing what they're looking for and sort of expediting all of it? What would you say to that, panelists?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we can look at what, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts, which I'm from Massachusetts originally. And when I was there, took Blue Cross, they were wonderful to work with. They were very reasonable, very forward thinking. They were, one of the early adopters of transcranial magnetic stimulation as well. And so if you look at their authorization, I think that can be a kind of a good template for other payers that will likely follow. And, it really looks very similar to S-Ketamine, the FDA-approved intranasal version. So usually you're looking at people who have tried at least 2 different antidepressants and had adequate trials where they haven't been able to tolerate or they haven't had efficacy. They have to be on an oral antidepressant. And then, there has to be some use of some validated rating scales, such as the HAM-D or the Beck Depression Inventory, different things to not only see the severity at start, but kind of they want to see progress kind of throughout the treatment. What Blue Cross did, which I think is controversial, is they did state that a psychiatrist would have to be the one administering and kind of running the show, which is not consistent with the field. I think many of us in the field, I'm a psychiatrist. I think the role of the mental health professional is for diagnosis and triage and seeing, is this a great candidate? But in terms of who actually does the administration, that's something where I think we're going to see different tension with payers as to what they want to do, because you'll see people from emergency medicine, anesthesia, much wider range, administering. And if I were to get it personally, I would much rather have one of those rather than a psychiatrist, because most psychiatrists, that's just not our area of expertise, but we're really good at diagnosing and overseeing if it's for a mental health indication. So that's what we're seeing there. I think other commercial payers will follow suit. Medicare really is looking more for people in their cohort, people who are on Medicare getting it, which is very tricky because those are oftentimes not the patients that are able to access it as it stands right now.
Well, thank you for that, Carlene. Super thorough. Any other thoughts from the other panelists? Go for it, brother.
Yeah, I can share perspective from, so at MindBloom, our goal is, I think other panelists share this goal as well, and probably many in the audience. The goal is ultimately to get broad health plan coverage for this treatment, but there are many steps along the way. And so at MindBloom, as we grow and hope to be able to work directly with insurers to offer this to our clients, we reach out to about a dozen like CEOs or commercialization leads at other like innovative treatment companies, like outside of mental health as well, just to understand what the various pathways were to payer coverage. So we talked to people on like weight loss, diabetes, diagnostics, musculoskeletal therapy, and just wanted to hear like, how did you do it? How did you get this covered? And so we heard a lot of very strong, confident perspectives that all contradicted each other, but the range of paths that people followed were anywhere from needing to go to payers with really legit academic clinical studies sponsored by prestigious institutions of large end studies that you can take to a payer. Some used their own real world evidence. Some began with pilots with insurance plans or through like the route of an employer, and went that route. And a lot of the kind of one of the consistent threads of what we heard is, of course, there's no one way, but you're really selling to people more so than institutions. And so understanding what a buyer or a benefits lead at a company is really looking for is really important. So when that comes to like ketamine, it's how do we demonstrate both symptom reduction, but also ROI, and make a case that somebody's not going to get, fired or grilled by their boss if they find out that they covered what might be viewed as a unsafe or stigmatized treatment. So I know there are a lot of other questions that we wanted to cover in the panel, so I'll kind of wait for future. But I think it's unfortunate, but also exciting that there's no clear path and, multiple ways that we as an industry could move towards this eventual goal.
Wow, thank you for that, Jack.
Those are giving you, our perspective. We at Klarisana, we kind of approach it in a little bit different way. I originally hoped that we'd be getting, that insurance companies would, see the intrinsic, value of what ketamine can do, but that wasn't exactly the case. So we opted to go a little bit different strategy. So we went in network with a whole variety of insurance companies, including Colorado Medicaid, Texas Medicaid, and New Mexico Medicaid. And so what we do is we basically we don't even basically bill for the ketamine. We just put together a collection of CPT codes based on an office visit. We use our therapists and, doing mental health treatment, and, the various CPT codes that go along with that as far as the ketamine assisted therapy, and have, the intake visits, integration visits, and whatnot. And basically have tried to work with economies of scale, to decrease our costs as much as possible. We switched over from an IV to an IM model, which has worked incredibly well, and actually we've shown in our published study it's equally effective to IV. And so for us, that's what we're able to do, is basically just try to allow people to use their insurance. We don't bill for ketamine per se. We basically just do those codes, and then we also do a advanced beneficiary notification, or consent form, basically saying that we're going to charge folks $37 for a non-covered service, because there really is, at least that I found, there's no CPT code that's called psychedelic guidance. So there's not a CPT code that says we're going to act as a shaman and guide you through this process. So we charge people $37 for that non-covered service. Then most of them, then it's just whatever their copay is for their insurance. And about 80% of our visits right now are folks using private insurance or government programs like TRICARE or Medicaid.
Wow. Thank you for that, Carl. Very informative. And are there any other innovative treatments that the panel can think of that have gained coverage that we can glean some inspiration from, and insofar as ketamine and its journey? Like, what's happened before us, and how can we harness that, if there's a way to do that, to sort of influence the journey of ketamine going forward here? And if nobody knows one, that's cool too.
Yeah, I'm not aware. I mean, the problem with ketamine is because it doesn't have that FDA indication, right? So that it's an uphill battle. So I mean, the best I can look to would be S-Ketamine, given we're getting more data on that, and then just looking at the path of transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is sort of a research-heavy treatment for mental illness, and seeing how that over the past decade has kind of chipped away at payers, and what they like in terms of like the rating scales, right? They're wanting to see certain functional improvements. I think modeling that, and as we go to different payers or self-funded employers, just kind of following that playbook, I think will be helpful. But I don't know of one that went from sort of non FDA approved in the way that ketamine is.
Got it. How long has S-Ketamine been approved by the FDA? It's branded as Spravato, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's branded as Spravato. It's been since March of 2019. Okay. And that rollout has also been bumpy. A lot of providers are not happy with the way that it's been reimbursed. Medicare did in 2021 create a special code for it, a G code that covers the cost of the drug as well as the whole kind of 2-hour experience that people go through. And so there is thinking that for medications like ketamine, and particularly ketamine assisted therapy, as well as other psychedelics, that getting those type of codes that are these sort of bundled rates would be advantageous. And I believe folks like at MAPS are working on that for, say, MDMA. And we're Lucia and I are on the ketamine task force, and we're trying to figure out that as well, and trying to petition for code. It's really hard to get a new CPT code in and to kind of look at all of the different elements that go into that. Sure. But that would be ideal. It's just right now people are making do, and you see different recipes that people will use to get maximum reimbursement. Yep. And different providers are, more or less comfortable with that.
Wow, thank you, Carlene. And a thought that's present with me to open up to the panel: what of the stigma of ketamine, like the fact that it obviously has a pedigree of having been used as a party drug to some extent, and people having experiences recreationally? Does that carry over into the conversations with insurers and the prospect of ketamine gaining, sort of that medical acceptance, the fact that it has that affiliation and sort of history, or is that not a factor and doesn't really enter into the conversations at the clinician level?
Yeah, I think it definitely does, as you're trying to get employers or payers to cover your services. Having this umbrella of this stigma is certainly not helping.
Yep.
And so I think that's and I know I'm preaching to the choir here with our panelists, but that's the value of having like large N studies on the safety and efficacy of ketamine. And so I think what Osmind and the Ketamine Task Force are doing is amazing. And we're trying to do the same by collecting really, believable, objective outcomes and safety data from beginning to end with our clients. And I think as the body of evidence gets larger and we're able to pilot with payers, or start to get some like big name, large employers who are self-insuring and look at both employee or member satisfaction along with the ROI and safety data, that'll gradually, convince big players in the field that this is the future of medicine and not a party drug.
Yeah. Lucia, thank you for that, Jack. Insightful. It reminds me a lot, team of cannabis and its journey to destigmatize, which is still, of course, on its journey, respectively. But Lucia, in terms of the Ketamine Task Force and the great work that you guys are doing in that lane, would you care to speak to that and sort of educate the audience about it? I'd love to hear more about it personally.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm speaking for some folks who are also in the audience here too. Kimberly is the head of our task force, and I think she's here in the Q&A. So I'll kick it off. But yeah, we're really excited about the work we're doing. The Ketamine Task Force is a 501c3 nonprofit whose sole focus is to acquire insurance coverage for ketamine for various indications. And because of all of the intricacies and nuances of ketamine that we've discussed, with it being off-label use for both pain and mental health conditions, the lack of coverage is really a huge barrier for access, and ultimately really sad that patients can't get the treatment that they need. So our goal is to be able to improve access through the insurance coverage and ultimately improve patient outcomes more broadly. So the approach that we've taken so far is identified a need to actually petition first Medicare. Because I think, as we've seen in the US, at least on the national level, it's really hard to achieve coverage without getting Medicare sign-off on anything. And so oftentimes commercial payers will follow suit for Medicare decisions. And in order to do that with Medicare, I think what they really want to see is that there is a large body of evidence, just like Jack said, that proves both safety and efficacy for ketamine treatment. Of course, there's a lot of different ways that we can go about this, because I think realistically, it's really hard to find a group that's going to want to do a full randomized control trial to prove the efficacy of ketamine. But because so much of it's happening already in the real world, we can actually leverage existing clinics and existing patients who so graciously volunteer to contribute their efficacy information to this larger body of evidence. So at least at Osmind, our part in the task force is working with the hundreds of clinics we have around the country to show that these ketamine treatments are actually working for patients. We've started first with CRPS, which is complex regional pain syndrome, and then we're moving on to mental health conditions, and then actually basically running a naturalistic observation on how clinics are using ketamine and looking at different functional and other types of rating scales to show improvement from before to after a course of ketamine treatment. And so we're still in early days for sure of sort of collecting this information and of packaging it and analyzing it for Medicare. But the ultimate goal is to get enough of a sample size so that we can actually show that these treatments are working for patients, that they're safe, and that ultimately Medicare hopefully will see that it results in better patient outcomes and therefore reduced costs for them. And the goal then after that is to go and show that to commercial payers. So we're in step 1 and step 2 of sort of this longer journey around insurance coverage. But I think everyone in the chat here and everyone here, I think we're all on the same page, and that this would be a win-win for both patients and providers. So if anyone wants to get involved to learn more about it, please feel free to put your name in the chat, and Kimberly and Carlene and I will figure out a way to reach out.
Awesome. Thank you, Lucia. Wow. Any other thoughts from anyone else? Cool. No problem. In terms of something that's present with me to also bring to the group after taking in all that great energy, Lucia, the notion of, ketamine is where it's at. It's on its journey. We're touching on all these nuances, implications on sort of the pathway of the other psychedelic compounds to come. Obviously, MDMA, psilocybin, they're all having their respective moments and their journey and pathway. How do you guys see this all intersecting, implications going forward for other psychedelic compounds that, are on their way as well? How is it all going to sort of shake out from your point of view?
I guess if I could comment on that, Lois, I mean, we're at Klarisana, we're obviously very excited about the possibility of introducing some of these other compounds in there. I think at some point we're going to look back in a few years and look at these various compounds as tools in a toolbox, and it's interesting. Sometimes you see debate in social media about, whether MDMA is better than ketamine or ketamine is better than MDMA or whatever the case may be, which is a little bit silly because it's kind of like arguing whether a screwdriver is better than a socket wrench, right? Depending on the task that you're trying to accomplish, either the appropriate tool is the appropriate tool. So I think it's going to be interesting someday incorporate these various substances and come up with a treatment plan that leverages the strengths of each one and utilizes them appropriately. So,
yeah, I can kind of comment on MDMA and psilocybin because I think of them in kind of different buckets. So MDMA, MAPS work, MAPS has been championing that for quite some time, doing very rigorous research. They are working with the FDA to get, everything in order. I think what we'll see with MDMA is something very similar to S-Ketamine in that we'll have what's called the REMS program, right? So they're going to release something, there's going to be certain controls. And they're wanting to figure out how therapy is going to fit into it. So with ketamine, the difference is there isn't any prescribed type of therapy that has to do it, right? You can just do ketamine alone in an office. Whether or not you should be, this larger controversy. But the reality is, it's not kind of specified in the label. Whereas MDMA really would include this therapy component, but I think you'll see kind of similar to S-Ketamine in the hoops that they are jumping through. Psilocybin, I think, is more analogous to the quagmire that we have here, because with psilocybin, you have companies like Compass coming up with COMP360 and these proprietary compounds that are going to be going through, this FDA route. And so we could end up in a situation where the FDA is approving these compounds and insurance is paying for these proprietary compounds, but not other forms of psilocybin. So in Oregon, when Measure 109 comes into effect and they have these people producing psilocybin, that's not going to be a proprietary, patented substance. We could run into the same kind of tensions that we get with ketamine, where the full patent on drug, S-Ketamine is like $800 something a dose. It's not very cost effective, but we could see a pathway where that stuff is approved for psilocybin, but not the actual kind of off-patent psilocybin. I think we don't want that, but I do think it is a reality if you kind of look at how history plays out. Maybe others have a more hopeful view around that.
That sounds, given the way that the world works, Carlene, unfortunately, pretty accurate to me. Commercialization inevitably leads to situations or potential for situations just like the one that you described.
Yeah,
I think it's really interesting.
Oh, go ahead, Lucia.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, Dr. Carlene, because I think that as we have MDMA and psilocybin through sort of different routes, certainly decrim and legalization, we all hope is going to be successful given the sort of inane nature why these drugs are illegal in the first place. But we've got Compass and MAPS and all these others going through the traditional FDA route. And I think there is the reality that that's going to merge with our mainstream healthcare system, and that patients hopefully will have an array of options. But if they want to go and undergo a formal MDMA-assisted psychotherapy and get their insurance to cover it, it's going to be that like patented version that is from the MAPS protocol. And I think my concern looking ahead is that this is just a whole new model for insurers to even consider. There's never been a drug where the FDA has approved therapy in conjunction with the molecule itself. And that has wide implications for how these treatments are going to get covered, because instead of looking at, just covering the drug itself and maybe some monitoring time after, you're looking at 12-hour sessions, things that are incredibly costly in payers' eyes. And so I think that it still remains to be seen how we're going to make these affordable for patients. And I think a big key to that puzzle is how we even collect the data to continue to show the efficacy of these treatments and that they're still ultimately cost effective despite potentially being longer. So I think at Osmind, we see our role being a pretty critical one in that even if and when MDMA and psilocybin-assisted therapy get approved as formal FDA-approved treatments, insurance companies are probably not going to cover it very favorably at first, and it's up to us as a community to prove that these treatments work and that they are still ultimately driving down cost savings.
Yeah, great points. Something to add in, I guess a reason that I'm hopeful is we're still probably at least 2 years away from MDMA FDA approval. So we have a lot of time as a ketamine provider community to demonstrate the effectiveness of ketamine, and especially in the like psychedelic medicine model. Because right now you have, you might break how ketamine's provided into more of a medical model or a pharmacological model of just getting the ketamine into your system. And like IV clinics who give ketamine over a longer period of time. There's even some pharmaceutical plays that are trying to minimize the dissociative effects of ketamine, kind of are more in this traditional mental health care model. And then there's the psychedelic therapy model where you're really leaning into that dissociative, or well, with ketamine it's dissociative, but this altered state. And these chemicals all have their own stigmas, but there's also just a broader stigma around altered states used for therapeutic benefit. And so I think as we show that this psychedelic medicine model where you're focusing on intentions and really leaning into the altered state experience and then working on integration after the fact, if we can show that that's really effective, then that starts to change the way that we think about using altered states therapeutically. And one thing we're doing at MindBloom is we, along with tracking safety and symptom suppression, we also track self-reported dissociation scores. So like how dissociated were you during your treatment? And we see, and it's almost like a perfectly positively correlated line of regression that shows that the stronger your self-reported dissociation, the more likely you are to get therapeutic benefit. And so that helps strengthen the case for the importance of having this altered or dissociative state. And so I think there's a lot we can do to pave the way for and build out the clinical models so that we're ready to, scale these chemicals once they're broadly available.
Wow, fascinating. Thank you, Jack. How about lower income communities? What are folks doing? I saw a great comment here from Laura on the chat thread. What efforts are being made to make these treatments accessible to folks in lower income brackets? Where's that at right now from sort of an industry perspective? Is there anybody leading the way on that?
Well, those that I mentioned, we are in network with Medicaid in all the 3 states that we participate in. So we have Texas Medicaid is extremely challenging. So that's kind of its own animal. Colorado Medicaid is pretty much the opposite end. It's an awesome system. It does very, very well. So we have a lot of Colorado Medicaid patients that we take care of. For them, this is the only option they have to receive this, just because it's much more affordable.
Wow.
Yeah, and I think, for S-Ketamine, initially, like in New York, the major Medicaid Health First, for the first year and a half or so, they weren't covering it, but then they started covering it. And so we've been able to at least give S-Ketamine to individuals for whom the traditional ketamine path was just not accessible. In terms of paying for ketamine, I think that's where different clinics and philanthropic efforts can kind of come into play. It's not a great long-term scalable solution, but you'll see that there are, a lot of efforts and a lot of interest in putting money into more nonprofit avenues to get this into more people's hands.
Wow,
I
fascinating.
I think the cost can come way down as well as we gain comfort with these molecules. So it's still, we're still discovering as a community how safely someone can use these with like different levels of therapeutic oversight. And so if we continue to demonstrate that these are safe to use, at home with a bit of instruction, then the cost of like generic ketamine tablets is really low. And so depending on where you fall in the heavy therapy versus, using the medicine safely on your own, there are ways to the clinical model itself could bring down the cost. So you're not paying, hundreds of dollars a session.
Thank you for that, Jack. Wow. Well, vibrant dialogue, team. I feel like we have a very robust dialogue happening here on the chat. Maybe it'd be a good idea to take some questions from the audience, unless anybody else has anything that they want to offer. It sounds like there's a lot of activity here. What's the best means of sort of selecting a question? I see a comment here from Samit over at Pharma Solutions. You make a note here that a company cannot manufacture a drug without FDA approval. Of course, if a company obtains a patent for a psychedelic drug, it will prevent another company manufacturing for 7 to 15 years. How do we feel about, and this touches a little bit on the comment earlier about Compass and sort of that, dynamic, should psychedelics be proprietary? Haven't these compounds existed in nature forever? Shouldn't everybody have access to these? And if we believe that, which I probably think we all do on some level, how can we responsibly steward that energy within the, construct of a commercialized society where, there's a psychedelics industry and there's people accessing treatment, through insurance and things like this, which is, of course, the topic of this panel. How do we square all of that? It's something that comes across my path quite a bit when folks talk to me about psychedelics, and there seems to be a little bit of a conflict there on some level. Any thoughts from the panel on that topic, or anyone from the audience?
I was just at the Horizons conference in New York, and this was brought up quite a bit in terms of the patents. There are, organizations like the Asana Institute doing more kind of open source drug development. And they actually mentioned, I think it's called Sophia Porta, where is basically a nonprofit that sprung up to look at overreaching patents in psychedelics and to look at what's called prior arts to see if there are ways that the field has been using these substances well before a drug company is putting together a patent to try to strike that right balance between innovation and not patenting things that have been around for centuries. I think we see drug companies developing truly novel delivery systems, or like someone mentioned, removing the dissociative effects, or removing some kind of effect in a new compound. Like, yeah, that's patentable. I think we'd all agree, right? Sure. But psilocybin, that's pretty much the same. That's where it gets much more tricky. And so I think as the field, we're wrestling with those tensions.
Yeah, it's interesting. And the indigenous, of course, have been shepherding these medicines in different forms for millennia. So is there a sense of how to sort of honor that lineage and, incorporate it? It's something that I'd love to see evolve at some point throughout this journey, right? It would be very sad. I think there's a Nagoya protocol that talks a lot about partnering with the indigenous where the medicines came from. And there's some folks that I've seen in the industry and psychedelics specifically talking about this. Is any company out there actively incorporating these principles into their, sort of approach here, or it's still something that's sort of nascent and not really mainstream and, sort of on the back burner a little bit? Any sense of that from the panel?
Yeah, I can't speak for too many folks, but I think that's totally, Los, you're on point there about trying to recognize where these things even came from and why we are lucky enough to be able to get to work in this field. I think we see that sort of similar to the access questions as well, of like ensuring that we are still making this treatment accessible no matter what your background is. I think on top of that, some companies and clinics we know of are not necessarily integrating some of these protocols, but for example, appointing boards and advisors that are in touch with the indigenous community, or promoting reciprocity in different ways. So yeah. I think those are sort of interesting threads for us to continue to think about as an industry and as we develop our businesses.
Thank you, Lucia. Received.
That's a valuable point, Los. I mean, that we've thought about that and talked about that internally to Klarisana. I think so far it's been just such an uphill battle getting people to accept the idea of psychedelics and that utilizing a non-ordinary state of consciousness to treat mental health conditions is valuable has been kind of its own challenge. So, but as we start to incorporate some of these other things, the point you make is extremely valid, and the contribution that centuries of what the indigenous folks have put into this, or it does need to be recognized and respected. So appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah, I appreciate you responding. And, in my experience, team and audience, I've been helping lay people who are non-indigenous get to medicines like ayahuasca, 5-MeO-DMT combo, and others for, over a decade. The way that I've been able to get a lot of people to open up their minds and their hearts to these medicines is by educating them about the roots of these medicines. So, if I was having a conversation, and not that this is something that I'm actively doing, but, with somebody at the FDA, I would invite them to learn about how it's done in the jungle, and what those traditions are. And I think by embracing that, and maybe one of the takeaways from this panel could be a concerted, set an intention to put some stuff in motion here to really embrace the lineage of all of this and help that actually inform and help educate and destigmatize these medicines. It's always been very curious to me that on Schedule 1 in this country, all the major medicines are listed there, right? Like, why is that? I've battled that for years as a cannabis entrepreneur and as a, personal advocate of these medicines and helping people sort of access them, whether it's in the jungle or in settings in this country that are more private. But, there's got to be a way to reconcile that. And the people on this panel, I can tell that you actually really do care about that. And you're the leaders of this industry. I would love to support any initiative or thought process or sort of energy there about how to harness that and use that actually as a means to properly implement commercialization. I actually think there's a way to have that be synchronistic and not something that's distractive, right? So just to say that, I'll jump off my soapbox because I'm just a moderator here.
Yeah, I mean, the drug scheduling is a big issue. I will say, ketamine is Schedule 3, does have, it's used in anesthesia, like a lot, it's been so, but for other substances, once they get FDA approval, part of that approval would involve changing the schedule away from Schedule 1. But I agree, it's absurd what we know as physicians in terms of certain things being at Schedule 1, where there clearly are medical uses. It's just become kind of farcical at this point.
It really has been. It makes one wonder, right? Motivations behind that and why things are the way that they are. But, I'm so inspired by being here and being able to moderate this panel. I personally learned a lot and feel like the audience did too. I don't have any more questions or things to sort of throw at you guys. I feel like we covered more of the salient points with insurance specifically. If we want to open it up to the audience or folks want to contribute something else here, go for it. But, I'm tapped out as far as giving you guys a hard time.
Some of the questions, I don't know if they necessarily apply to insurance. Do you want us to dive into some of the ones?
Yeah, let's do it. I mean, folks are engaged here, and I think that we can go outside of the box a little bit. Let's pick one or two here and get into it. What are some good ones? Let's do it.
One of the ones I saw that comes up a lot is the whole idea of just ketamine. When you use ketamine to treat addiction, is that a good idea? Are you just changing? Are you switching one substance for another? And I think that idea is fundamentally flawed, right? The experience we've had. We opened in 2015, so all the patients we've treated with alcohol abuse, especially opiate addiction and whatnot. Ketamine is not substituting one for another. Take opiate addiction for a moment, right? If somebody has addicted to opiates, it's probably started with some real cause for their pain, be it a surgery or whatnot. They ended up getting tolerance, which we all know about, but then they also probably developed opiate-induced hyperalgesia. When you take ketamine, which gets in there and blocks the NMDA receptor at the dorsal horn and just and derails that whole central sensitization pathway, people don't need the opiate. We finally get them broken off of that cycle, which is incredible. So it's not like they're going to stop taking 100 micrograms of fentanyl a day and 8 tablets of oxycodone and suddenly just start taking ketamine every day. Once we break that with the occasional maintenance sessions, we're able to effectively get them off of that. Alcohol is another thing. I mean, many of the people in the audience and on the panel recognize that alcohol, of course, is used as a compensatory mechanism to deal with some underlying issues. People use it as a stress mitigator and whatnot. If we can get in and treat the underlying issues that are leading them to want to drink in the first place, many of them dramatically cut down their alcohol use, and they're not using ketamine. So if we do a series of 6 sessions, an induction series, followed by, now we do like 3 or 4 cap sessions with lozenges, followed by that, but then maintenance sessions, let's say every 2 to 3 months, the overall yearly exposure to ketamine for our patients is pretty darn minimal, as opposed then if you take someone who was drinking up to a fifth of vodka every night to deal with whatever it is, and we've transitioned them from that to just maintenance sessions with ketamine every 2 or 3 months. I'd say it's a big win, and we are not at all substituting one substance for another.
Wow, very well said. In my experience in working with a lot of folks with ayahuasca and these other medicines, I've had people say sometimes, well, exactly, aren't I just developing another crutch? And, these treatments and medicines, of course, are not in their purest form recreational substances. When they're applied with intention, properly administered, and there's integration. I think that's another big piece here that maybe isn't perfectly within the mandate of the panel, but something worth noting, that proper integration is everything. Having the actual experience or the treatment is probably 5% of the work. What you do with it afterwards is what really makes the difference. And I have seen really help create transformative outcomes for folks that go to the jungle or other places to seek out these medicines. If you're setting an intention and you're doing the work thereafter, you're going to improve whatever's going on. And to your point, Carl, get underneath why people are consuming too much alcohol you're right, like what's underneath that. And I hope that psychedelics can continue to dissolve the illusion of separation and bring people into communion, that we are healers ourselves, and we can heal ourselves with our minds and proper use of these medicines and through community. And that's the ultimate medicine. So yeah, you're touching on something that's near and dear to my heart, friend.
Right. I mean, you got to look at the difference between numbing and inspiring results, right? I mean, you take alcohol; it's purely a numbing.
Yeah.
It's a solvent, really. I mean, it's the same thing you use to clean the floor or degrease your brakes or something like that, right? It's an extremely simple compound, versus what we're all talking about here is more of an inspired response. It's not that we're, patients are going to be doing ketamine. So, I mean, sure, there's some people who are abusing all that kind of stuff. I mean, most of the folks we take care of once they see the strings on the puppets, once they see the backstage pass to the world and whatever in their lives, it's not about like, oh, I want to start snorting ketamine every day. I mean, very few. I know it's one question I might touch on if you will let me ask about actors, young adults. We have a number of teenagers we take care of, especially a very large population of, however it worked out, female teenagers who have various issues that we've had very good success with. It is a very at-risk population. So from our standpoint, we have them evaluated by our own internal mental health professionals. We have 3 psychologists working in our company, and we're about to hire a 4th in the next couple of weeks, and our various therapists. But anyone below the age of 18, any of our teenage patients, we require they get consent from either their child psychologist or child psychiatrist, and we involve them in the treatment team. So that's a very valid point. We don't just shoot willy-nilly with 15-year-olds. Mm-hmm. That patient population is very vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow.
And I would just note in terms of insurance coverage for adolescents also, that's a problem even with S-Ketamine. So like that, a lot of these drugs that we're talking about, adolescent insurance coverage is even a greater hill to climb, which there's a lot of kids, I think, who could benefit under the right environment who are kind of left out.
Wow, inspired dialogue here. And I know the fearless host has joined us again, Paul. If you'd like to jump in, brother, and make your beautiful presence felt, friend, we'd love it. And thank you for allowing us to have this panel. I really enjoyed it. I feel like the panel did too. And judging by the comments, I think the audience thinks it was a time well spent.
Great. Thanks so much, Los, and to all the panelists. That was incredible. And I will say, having had the good fortune and the privilege of hosting quite a few webinars in both the cannabis industry through Global Go and the psychedelic industry through Psychedelics Go, I don't think I've ever seen as an engaged an audience as the sessions that we're having today. And it's rich, sophisticated, important content. So this, we could have done an hour just with what was out there in the metaverse, if you will. I'll tell you my takeaways. One is paramount here is I could not be more impressed with the attitude and the approach and the commitment to science and the commitment to patient care that every one of our panelists and our moderator exhibited today. And it inspires a huge amount of confidence in me about sort of the safety and the efficacy and the process around this. And I say, without being facetious, I'm more ready for a ketamine session now for my own self-healing than I was before, just hearing how serious and what a sort of fiduciary duty that all of the practitioners that spoke today bring to their practice. And it's fascinating as a business person and as a person that's interested in health and wellness for most of my life to see how this is all going to play out. Is ketamine going to be the skeleton key that will soon one day see these same clinics serving a whole host of other medicines and therapies? We've discussed several of those today. Is ketamine being used right now for more off-brand indications than it might actually be appropriate for because of its unique ease of regulated access at a time when the culture is like awfully curious about the entire category and its utility for self-help? And how does a practitioner screen patients, if you will, to screen out a patient that might be more interested in a good experience but might not fit under the quote-unquote medical category? And where is that line? I mean, I feel I should be able to be my own practitioner to some degree, but I also can understand that as someone said, there's already a run on ketamine. There's a shortage apparently because of the surging demand. So there's a lot to work out, but I gotta say, when you consider the approach of all of the providers here, it gives me so much confidence, and it should give everyone confidence about just how solemn and much sanctity is brought to the development of this industry. There is another panel in a half hour at 1 o'clock, but you should stick around for that. It's going to be great. It's about the path towards monetization. And in the interim, while waiting for our third and final panel of the day, please hang out with Joe Moore from Psychedelics Today, and who'll help explore some of the discussion points that the panelists brought up or the live feed brought up. So please hang out with us, and we'll see you all again in a half hour to have our final panel of the day. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.